There are times when we have to confront stories that are just plain chilling, and this is one of them. We're taking a deep dive, and I mean deep, into the life and crimes of Richard Speck, a man whose name is synonymous with the brutal 1966 Chicago nurse murders.
And what's truly unsettling about this case, what really gets under your skin, is how each chapter of Speck's life seems to almost foreshadow the horror that's to come. It's like watching the slow-motion train wreck, You see it coming, the devastation, but you're powerless to stop it.
Like a car crash you can't look away from.
Yeah.
But we're not just here to relive those murders, are we? We're here to understand the path that led there, to unpack how a person becomes capable of such unspeakable acts.
Exactly. We need to understand the making of a monster. And for Richard Benjamin Speck, that story starts in 1941, Kirkwood, Illinois. Seventh of 8 kids, a family crippled by poverty, and then, at just 6 years old, tragedy strikes. His father dies of a heart attack.
6 years old. I mean, that's got to be a turning point for any kid. That kind of loss at such a young age. But then things get even more unstable for young Richard, don't they?
They absolutely do. His mother remarries a man named Carl Lindbergh, and let's just say he wasn't exactly a positive male role model. Alcoholism, violence, even arrests. This wasn't a home, it was a breeding ground for fear and instability.
As those early experiences, that environment, it leaves its mark on Speck. 12 years old, he's drinking. By 15, it's a daily habit. And then come the run-ins with the law. Petty theft at first, but it escalates, doesn't it? Burglary, forgery, even assault. You can almost feel it, like that pressure building.
It's like a powder keg waiting to explode. It exploded does. He tries to escape, tries to outrun those demons, even gets married in 1962, has a daughter. But the violence, it's always there, simmering beneath the surface, fueled by the alcohol. By 1966, that marriage, it crumbles.
Which brings us to what some might call Speck's road to Chicago, this pivotal period where he ends up back in his hometown, Monmouth, Illinois. And it's not just troubled, it's like looking into a dark mirror knowing what's coming next.
And there are 2 incidents in particular, 2 encounters that send shivers down your spine when you think about what's to come. The first one, an attack on a 65-year-old woman, a Mrs. Virgil Harris.
And the details are just unsettling. He breaks into her house, ties her up, brutally assaults her. What's even more disturbing is that Mrs. Harris described her attacker as, and I quote here, very polite, a tall man with a southern drawl. I mean, how chilling is that?
It's bone-chilling, this polite demeanor masking something truly sinister, a glimpse into the darkness that lay beneath. Then, just a week later, another woman, Mary Catherine Pierce, a 32-year-old barmaid, vanishes.
Gone, without a trace. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, her body is later found in a hog house. But here's the detail that always gets me. Speck had helped build that very hog house just weeks before.
The police suspected Speck. They had their eyes on him. But by then, he had vanished again. This time, he was heading for Chicago. And he wasn't just carrying stolen goods. He was carrying the weight of his past, the potential for violence growing stronger.
So picture this. It's April 19th, 1966, and Richard Speck arrives in Chicago. A convicted felon with this incredibly disturbing history of violence towards women, especially when you consider what happened back in Monmouth.
And it's critical to remember this isn't just some isolated incident or random act of violence. This is a pattern of escalating brutality. It's like this slow, dreadful crescendo building towards something far more sinister.
He ends up staying with his sister, trying to make a go of it, to start fresh. He gets a job as an apprentice seaman but loses it, tries again with the National Maritime Union, even gets assigned to a tanker.
It's almost as if fate, or maybe just rotten luck, had other plans for him. When Speck shows up at the tanker, ready to ship out, he's told his spot has been filled just like that. Defeated, he goes back to the hiring hall, but it's closed. No job, no money, and seemingly no hope.
He's adrift. Days turn into weeks, and Speck is just drifting, spending his time in these seedy motels and bars, the anger and resentment eating away at him. And then comes July 13th, a Wednesday evening. Speck encounters 53-year-old Ella Mae Hooper. That encounter, that's where things take an even darker turn.
Speck and Hooper had both been in and out of taverns that day, each seeking solace or escape in the bottom of a glass. But for Speck, this chance meeting, this encounter, would have terrifying consequences.
He confronts her at knife point, forces her back to his room, assaults her, and then steals her .22 caliber pistol. This isn't just a robbery, is it? It's like a terrifying preview, a foreshadowing of the violence to come.
A practice run, almost. It's deeply unsettling.
Now armed with a switchblade and Hooter's gun, Speck has dinner, then heads back to the Shipyard Inn's tavern for more drinks. By 10:20 p.m., he leaves the bar and starts walking. Just a man on a walk, right? Except he's not just any man. He's heading west on 100th Street towards an ordinary-looking two-story brick townhouse at 2319 E 100th.
He has no way of knowing it, of course. But that townhouse houses 8 student nurses, 8 young women about to become entangled in his horrific narrative.
It's almost midnight, July 13th, when Speck reaches that townhouse, that unassuming brick building. He forces his way in, and you can't help but wonder what's going through his mind at this point.
Yeah.
Was this always the plan? Did something in him just snap?
It's the question that hangs over this entire case, this constant what if. We can look at the evidence, analyze his actions, his past, but we're really just grasping at straws when it comes to his state of mind. What we do know, without a doubt, is that inside that townhouse, there were 8 young women completely oblivious to the horror that was about to unfold.
8 student nurses, some probably asleep, some maybe getting ready for bed, all of them dedicating their lives to caring for others. And they were about to come face to face with a level of depravity that's hard to even comprehend.
Speck had that switchblade, remember, and that stolen gun. He overpowers them, herds them into a single room. It's a terrifying display of power, of control, and he keeps them there for hours, just prolonging their fear, twisting that sense of safety into something unbearable.
And then the murders begin. He starts leading the women out of that room one by one. It's almost methodical, calculated, like a macabre procession.
The level of violence, it's beyond disturbing. Stabbings, strangulation, some of the victims suffered both. This wasn't just about ending their lives. There was a personal, almost intimate element to the brutality, a level of rage that defies any kind of rational explanation.
It just feels like a nightmare, something you couldn't possibly imagine surviving. And yet, amidst all that horror, there's this tiny flicker of hope. Corazon Murroy.
Corazon's survival is just incredible. It's a testament to pure luck, to quick thinking, and incredible courage. While Speck is preoccupied elsewhere in the house, she manages to slip away, hide under a bed.
Can you imagine the terror, the agonizing weight, listening to what was happening to her friends, knowing that at any moment he could find her?
She stayed hidden for hours, clinging to life. She didn't come out until nearly 6 a.m., long after Speck had left and the sun had started to rise on that horrific scene.
Corazon survived, but at what cost? The relief of her escape forever intertwined with the loss of her friends, her classmates. Nina Jo Schmau, Patricia Matusek, Pamela Wilkin, Gloria Jean Davies, Suzanne Ferris, Marianne Jordan, Rolita Gargulo, Valentina Pichon. 8 lives snuffed out in a single night of terror.
It sent shockwaves through Chicago, through the entire country, really. This wasn't just a local tragedy, it was a national nightmare. Parents were terrified for their children. That sense of safety, of security, it was shattered.
And the question on everyone's mind, who could do something like this? How could it happen here?
The manhunt was immediate, relentless. They had fingerprints from the scene, and they all pointed to one person, Richard Speck. They had a name, a face, but he was gone, vanished into the city.
He could run, but he couldn't outrun his past. Not this time.
And as it turned out, it was Speck's own demons that ultimately led to his capture.
So Speck's on the run, leaving this city, this community, just reeling in fear. What finally leads to his capture? What ends this nightmare?
You know, it's a strange mix of, well, desperation on Speck's part and then almost unbelievable luck. A few days after the murders, he ends up holed up in this rundown hotel room, trying to drink away the fear, the guilt, the enormity of what he'd done. He even tries to take his own life, slashes his wrists.
It's chilling to think, isn't it? What if he had succeeded? Would they have ever definitively tied him to the murders? Would those families have ever gotten closure?
It's a haunting thought. But thankfully, another resident, a woman in the hotel, she finds him. He's bleeding, clearly in bad shape. She calls for help, and Speck is rushed to Cook County Hospital. He had no idea, of course, that he was about to come face to face with the man who would ultimately seal his fate.
And that's where Dr. Leroy Smith comes in. His role in all of this is just incredible, isn't it?
It really is. Dr. Smith, like pretty much everyone in Chicago at that time, was following the news of the murders, the manhunt. And when Speck ends up under his care, something about him, something small, triggers a memory for Dr. Smith.
And it all comes down to something seemingly insignificant, a tattoo.
Exactly. A tattoo on Speck's arm that read, and I'm quoting here, "Born to raise hell." It was a detail that had been released to the press, to the public, and it was that phrase, that chilling phrase, that connected the dots for Dr. Smith. The man on his examination table, the one who tried to end his own life, was the monster everyone was looking for. He immediately contacts the police.
Can you imagine being Dr. Smith in that moment? I mean, the realization that the man everyone was terrified of, that everyone was hunting, was right there. It must have been surreal.
I can only imagine. The police, of course, they descend on the hospital and Speck is finally apprehended. It was over. This wave of relief, it must have washed over Chicago, but the fight wasn't over, not really. The pursuit of justice, that was just beginning.
Speck's trial, it starts in April 1967, and it becomes this huge media sensation. The whole country, it seemed, was captivated by this case. Everyone's searching for answers, for some way to make sense of such senseless violence.
And the prosecution, they had a rock-solid case. The physical evidence, the eyewitness accounts, it all pointed directly to Speck.
But it was Corazon Amiro's testimony. That's what really stayed with people.
It's hard to even fathom the courage it took for her to face the man who had taken so much from her, to relive that night in front of the world. But she did it. She pointed to Speck in the courtroom, and without a shred of a doubt in her voice, she said, "This is the man."
Chilling. Those 3 words, they carry the weight of that entire horrific night, the weight of her survival, the weight of 8 lost lives. The jury, they deliberated for less than an hour, 49 minutes, before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts.
Speck was sentenced to death, which, on the surface, felt like a small measure of justice for those 8 young women and their families. But because of the legal complexity surrounding capital punishment at the time, his sentence was later commuted to life in prison.
So he lived out his days behind bars. Case closed, right? Except even in prison, Speck's story, it just continues to shock and disturb.
It really does. His time in prison, it was marked by violence, defiance. But I think what's most chilling, what really gets under your skin, is the complete lack of remorse. There are even these videotapes that surfaced years later. He's on camera, boasting about the murders, even claiming that he could have done it sober.
Just when you think you've heard the worst of it, something like that comes out. It just cements his legacy as a symbol of pure evil. Speck died in prison in 1991. A heart attack, I think it was. But the questions, they linger, don't they?
They do. I think the Richard Speck case, it's not just about one man's descent into darkness. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the potential for evil that lurks within seemingly ordinary people.
It's a terrifying reminder that monsters, they don't always lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they walk among us, their true nature hidden until it explodes into violence like this. And as much as we try to understand the why, sometimes those answers just aren't there.
We can try to learn from it, though. Remember the victims, honor their memories, and continue to fight for a world where something like this doesn't happen again. That's the least we can do.